Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rise of Tensions, Threats to Peace, a back-to-back primers on militarism launch. I am Vincent from the Asia Pacific Research Network, and I'll be your host for today. We're really excited that we're finally able to present these two primers to the world. Um, we present to you number one is the NATO Imperialist War Machine, which is a primer on the Northeast Atlantic Treaty Organization and their military intervention across the globe. This was written to shed light on NATO's activities leading up to their 2023 summit in Madrid, Spain. The second primer is entitled Power Play, Unraveling Military Agreements in the Asia Pacific. This primer talks about the several military alliances operating in the region and, of course, their implications to our already precarious security landscape. And so many organizations have been supporting the development of these two primers, but we'd like to recognize the contributions of the Resist US-led war movement, because without their help, these primers won't see the light of day. And now I'm sure all of you are very excited to read these primers. We will also directly email all registrants a copy of the primers. So just sit tight. And alternatively, you may also download the digital copies of the primers through the QR code flashed on our Zoom backgrounds. So it's right here. Hopefully you could use that. But yeah, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We have prepared a jam-packed program for you, our lovely audience, so make sure to listen and participate. But before I introduce our first speaker for today, I just like to remind everyone of some house rules for the meeting. Number one is please change your Zoom name to your name and organization to avoid, any unnecessary confusion. Number two, we encourage everyone to turn on their video cameras so that even though this is an online launching, it can be as immersive as possible. Number three, kindly stay muted while our speakers and reactors are sharing their inputs so that we won't disrupt the program and their momentum. And the fourth one is we have a question and answer portion later on. So please jot down any questions that you may have, and we'll try to answer all of them, okay? And lastly, you may also use the chat box for any questions or concerns. Our team will try to answer them accordingly. All right, so to start us off, our first speaker is no other than Ms. Julia Puno. She's the Policy and Research Officer of the Asia Pacific Research Network and has also been active in global anti-imperialist campaigns for several years. So let's give her a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Vincent. Greetings of peace and solidarity to everyone. I am Julia Puno from the Asia Pacific Research Network. Before anything else, I'd like to thank the Resist US-led war movement for helping us produce the two primers we are launching today. That's the primer on NATO, as Vincent has mentioned, as well as the primer on military agreements in the Asia Pacific. Of course, we'd also like to thank you, our dear audience, for supporting this launch and for your interest in our publications. Lastly, we'd like to offer our sincerest gratitude to all of the people's organizations, communities, and people's movements who continuously resist and oppose the warmongering of imperialists around the world. It is their struggle which breathes life and gives relevance to our educational materials. The Asia Pacific Research Network, through our member organizations and allies, have been closely monitoring the geopolitical tensions of the Asia Pacific region for over 2 decades. During this period, we have seen a transition in our world order. For the most part of the past century, the United States was able to secure military footholds across the planet. However, China's steady development as an imperialist power challenges this very configuration. This multipolar rebalancing of imperialist nations forced the world's biggest economies to rely on military might to protect and secure their interests. This helps explain why we have been seeing a level of concentration of military power and aggressive military posturing in the region that was last seen during the Second World War. The US and China are each other's throats. Without even peering into the military situation, you could sense as much just from looking at their leaders' pronouncements. In an effort to defend their economic interests in Asia, they have been mobilizing their soldiers, missiles, warships, fighter jets, and their overseas bases. But the US and China understand that their own armed forces won't be enough. Then they need military support from other countries as well. a tactic that has been abused several times in human history, as seen in ancient wars and even in the past world wars. The US has already been leading several military alliances, most notably as the Northeast Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which has explicitly labeled Russia and China as strategic threats. But they have also facilitated the recent creation of military agreements in the Asia Pacific to hammer out defense deals to contain China. Not to mention that the US has been conducting numerous diplomatic state visits in the region under their Pivot to Asia strategy. Meanwhile, China has also been at the forefront of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has been ramping up their military focus throughout the years. If we look at the security landscape for the past 2 years, we'll see that in February 2022, the war in Ukraine began along with NATO's massive weapons transfer to Ukraine. In the same month, Ukraine peace talks started, but NATO refused to settle with Ukraine's military victory. In May 2022, Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership. In June, the NATO summit took place in Madrid, where the alliance effectively designated Russia and China as enemies. By August 2022, the Rim of the Pacific Joint Exercises in Hawaii, or RIMPAC, was held. There were around 35 countries which participated. Come September 2022, the US launched its first ever Pacific Island strategy, which legitimizes more US military presence in the Pacific Islands. In November, the US, Japan, Republic of Korea's trilateral military agreement at the East Asia Summit was officially launched, and in December, we have seen that Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed the US Congress. All of these events in 2022 alone, and this year we've been seeing more of the same. Last January, the US-Japan 2 plus 2 meeting took place when the two countries expressed their commitment to address evolving security challenges in Asia. That same month, Germany, a NATO member country, promised to send tanks to Ukraine. In February, the Philippine government agreed to establish 4 new US military bases in the country through the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA. In March, Slovakia and Poland, both NATO member countries, promised to provide Ukraine with fighter jets. That month also witnessed the start of US, Japan, Republic of Korea military exercises in the Korean Peninsula. AUKUS members countries also met in San Diego in March, where the US expressed their intention to increase their rotational military presence in Australia's maritime territories. The US has also deployed their first permanent military troops in Poland. In April 2022, we have seen Finland join NATO, and the US-Philippines 2 plus 2 meetings took place. The Balikatan exercises in the Philippines were also held with double the amount of troops and even included Australia. It was also in this month when the Washington Declaration between the US and Korea happened. In this meeting, the Republic of Korea expressed their trust in the US military capabilities. And just last month, in May 2022, we have seen the Group of Seven, or G7, have their 49th summit in Hiroshima, Japan. Not only was this an affront to the violent history suffered by the citizens of Hiroshima, but the summit was also used as a springboard to launch the Hiroshima Accord between the United Kingdom and Japan. The G7 was also used as a venue for the United Kingdom to promise Storm Shadow long-range missiles and F-16 advanced fighter jets to Ukraine. Imperialists have indeed been busy, and that is needless to say, as we've seen the developments for the past 2 years alone. Our NATO primer and the primer on military alliances in the Asia-Pacific captured and documented these activities. But more importantly, the two primers are launching today discuss how the people have been fighting back. And we think that this is all the more important. And we will hear more about the people's resistance from our next set of speakers for today. We believe that these primers, or any APRN publication for that matter, does not have value on its own. Being aware of US and China's rivalry and how they translate to military expeditions in the world is not enough. We hope today's back-to-back primer launching will not be limited to equipping participants with what's happening in the region, but all the more inspire them to take action to put an end to all forms of war led by imperialist regimes. We hope our common aspiration to expose and oppose imperialist aggressions continues to bring our movements closer and unite us further wherever we find ourselves across the world. From the Philippines and all the countries in the regions, let's dare to struggle and dare to fight towards just and lasting peace. Long live international solidarity and power to the people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. That was a very comprehensive sharing on our current peace and security situation. Now, if our participants are interested to read more on what she shared, I think that timeline will be uploaded soon by Resist and APRN. So check that out on our social media platforms. And yeah, I can't stress enough the importance of collective action. Although the times are tough, our movement and our unity must be tougher. Now, to share with us stories of people's resistance from the Global South, we have Mr. Teddy Casino, the chairperson of the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, or the New Patriotic Alliance. Yeah, Mr. Casino, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good day to everyone. Thank you to the Asia Pacific Research Network and the Resist US-led War Movement for inviting us, and of course for coming up with these very relevant and timely primers on US military agreements and the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations. These are very important reference materials that activists and ordinary persons who are interested in these issues can use to deepen their understanding of what is happening in the world today. I will first give an introduction of my organization, then a background of the Philippine struggle against US militarism and war, our successful campaign to kick out the US military bases in 1991, and some lessons that we have learned. So Bayan is an anti-imperialist alliance of mass organizations in the Philippines that fights for the Filipino people's national democratic aspirations. It was formed in 1985 at the height of the people's struggle against the US Marcos dictatorship. So it serves as a center for various campaigns and struggles against US imperialist aggression and intervention, including not just the military aspect, but its neoliberal offensive in the economic, political, and cultural spheres. So Bayan played a leading role in the historic campaign to kick out the US military bases in the Philippines in 1991. At that time, Subic Naval Base and Clark Air Base were the two biggest US military bases outside the US mainland. So you can imagine how important those facilities were for the United States. And many people thought that they would be there forever. So they were kicked out in 1991, but unfortunately, US troops and facilities have returned through a series of military agreements. Chief among them, the Visiting Forces Agreement of 1998, the Mutual Logistics and Support Agreement, and lately the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement of 2017. So today, Bayan and the Filipino people are in the thick of the fight to defend Philippine sovereignty against the two most powerful imperialist powers in the world, the United States and China, that are currently locked in a struggle for hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. And the Philippines, given its strategic location, we find ourselves in the thick of this arms race between China and the United States. So as a background on our fight against US militarism and intervention, Bayan's struggles against imperialist aggression and military intervention is actually part of a long history of anti-imperialist struggle by the Filipino people, tracing back to the anti-colonial revolution against Spain in 1896. So after defeating Spain in 1898, we were faced with a more cunning and powerful colonial power, and this was the United States. In fact, the Philippines, as far as I know, is the first country in the Global South to have actually fought a war against the United States. This was in 1899. The Philippine-American War lasted 4 years, but the fighting actually went on way much longer. It's estimated that more than 1 million Filipinos died due to that war. And the atrocities committed by US troops during the Philippine-American War served as a template for its future wars of aggression, particularly in Vietnam. The Philippines is actually known by or called by many historians as the first Vietnam. Thus, thus did the Philippines become a colony of the US from 1902 to 1946. And it was at this time that the US military bases, as I said, in Clark and Subic and other places, 22 other places were established. During that colonial period, there developed a strong movement against US imperialism and for national independence. In fact, the first modern trade union in the Philippines, the Unión Obrera Democrático, this was formed in 1902, came out openly against US imperialism and called for national independence. And as expected, the US colonial government cracked down on the trade unions, and the officers of the Unión Obrera Democrática were either arrested or forced to resign from the union. So that was dismantled. But in 1931, the Communist Party was formed from the trade union movement, and it also spearheaded campaigns against US imperialism and for genuine independence. And it does so till this day. Now, after the grant of independence, after World War II, this was in 1946, the US imposed a series of economic and military agreements on the Philippine government that basically tied the Philippines as a neo-colony of the United States. And till this day, we have that neo-colonial relations with the US. So among the major agreements, and I'll just focus on the military agreements, was the 1947 Military Bases Agreement that allowed the US unhampered use of 22 military facilities, including 5 major military bases for 99 years. So, it basically tied the military bases forever in the Philippines. There was also the formation of the Joint US Military Advisory Group in 1947 that basically institutionalized US military intervention in internal security operations in the Philippines, including counterinsurgency operations against anti-imperialist movements. So that would include the Hukbalahap, which is the military arm of the Communist Party then, and then later on the New People's Army, which was the military arm of the re-established Communist Party. There was the 1953 Military Bases Agreement, a military assistance agreement, that basically locked in the Philippines in terms of military equipment, supplies, and technology to US arms suppliers. And the 1957 Mutual Defense Treaty that tied our defense and security policies to US geopolitical interests. So these agreements served to basically strengthen the hold of the US militarist agenda on the Philippines despite the grant of independence in 1946. So since then, every patriotic and democratic movement in the Philippines would include calls for an end to US military intervention in the Philippines and the abrogation of these insidious one-sided agreements. Now, among the climax of that struggle, among the major victories, if not the biggest victory we had, was the removal of the US military bases in 1991. So how was this achieved? In the dying days of the Marcos regime, the dictator agreed to hold snap elections, and the challenger was Corazon Aquino, who made a concession to get the support of the progressive groups, made a concession to include the removal of the US military bases in her platform. Now, following the ouster by people power of the Marcos regime in 1986, there were patriotic elements in the Constitutional Convention that included a provision in the new constitution that stated that after the expiration of the military bases agreement in 1991, no foreign military troops, bases, or facilities would be allowed in the Philippines except under a treaty. So with the election of the new Senate, Bayan and other progressive movements launched a nationwide campaign to educate the people against the need to remove the US bases So massive mobilizations were organized nationwide. Alliances were formed with various sectoral organizations, political parties, social movements, and high-profile personalities to campaign against the bases. So riding on the strength of this massive nationwide grassroots campaign, we lobbied in the Senate for against the extension of the military bases agreement. So that succeeded in 1991. And despite Aquino reneging on her promise and even trying to mobilize 1 million people to support the retention of the US bases, she did not succeed. Now, there were several factors to this victory. One, of course, was the strong and sustained, consistent anti-bases campaign that we had. Second, of course, the ouster of the US-backed Marcos dictatorship, which opened the way for the new constitution and placing the provision against the bases there. Externally, there was the end of the Cold War. And then as a factor also, the explosion of Mount Pinatubo, which was close to the military bases in Clark and Subic. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, this victory did not last long. And the US decided to creep back in the Philippines through the Visiting Forces Agreement and its military exercises, interventions, the MLSA, and now the EDCA bases. Now, just a few lessons to end my talk, a few lessons from the struggle. One is that the fight against US militarism and interventionism takes several forms. Of course, we have the campaigns, the struggles against US military intervention in our internal affairs, including the presence of US troops and facilities in the Philippines, their abuses, and these one-sided agreements. Secondly, is that it is also, or part of the struggle is the campaign against military aggression in other countries. So we participated very actively in the anti-bases, anti-war, pro-peace movements, especially the war on Iraq and Afghanistan, the big mobilizations that we held in support or against the war on terror. Part of the struggle also was the campaigns against US-dictated economic policies, which is the other side of the coin of US military aggression. And then I think this is the biggest factor, our struggle against the US-backed government of Marcos at the time, and also the subsequent governments that connives with US imperialism in imposing anti-people policies and programs. So our greatest victory, which was the removal of the US bases, was actually an offshoot of the struggle to oust the US-backed Marcos dictatorship. So we in our experience, the anti-imperialist and anti-fascist struggle is really closely interlinked. And of course, a big lesson also is that the fight against US militarism is an international struggle. So international solidarity is important, both with our colleagues in the US mainland and in other countries opposed to US militarism and war. So the importance of the Asia-wide campaign, the Ban the Bases campaign, the frequent exchanges among anti-bases and anti-imperialist organizations is very important of that struggle. So I will end there, and we'll be open to questions later on if there will be time. Thank you very much, and good day to all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Casino. Indeed, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement really further turns the Philippines into a launchpad of US imperialism. Your input really confirms that the US is no friend of the people. Rather, these imperialists are parasites that must be expelled. The ousting of the US military bases back in 1991, this set an incredible precedent, for people's movements across the planet. It has been shown that this is possible. This victory is possible, and it's just a matter of continuing and expanding our anti-imperialist struggle. Now, at this point, joining us now from the United States, our next speaker is Mr. Cody Urban from the Resist US-led War Movement and the International People's Front. He will share with us today how the people have also been resisting imperialism directly from within the belly of the beast. Let's welcome to our virtual stage, Mr. Cody Urban.
Thank you, Vincent. And thanks, Teddy and Julia, everyone who's on. What I really appreciated about Teddy's presentation, the example of ousting the US military bases from the Philippines. It really was that. It was an ouster. It was not just a Senate vote. And that's one thing that I think is so powerful from that example, is that we can do whatever we can to get our governments to act in our favor, but our governments don't act in our favor in the current system we have. Our governments act out of fear of our power when we build that power. And I think that's something that we've really been able to see as we've written these primers that have detailed the history of US-led military activity around the world. But it's also, both of the primers have ample space in them for people's resistance, what that looks like. So thanks for Teddy for giving an example from the Philippines. I will, if I had maybe at least 5 hours, I could make a small dent in the description of what resistance to US militarism looks like in the global north as well. Because I only have 10 minutes, which I'll start my camera for, my timer for right now. I wanted to just give some examples to kind of paint a picture of what our members in the Resist US-led War movement are involved in, but also just other activities that we see all over the world, organized, unorganized, in the process of getting organized, that are making that dent together. So if you want to learn about this, definitely read our primers on NATO and US military agreements in Asia Pacific. But I'm also going to lay out some examples from another booklet that the Resist US-led War movement has, which is our 2023 anti-militarism agenda that lays out main points of resistance to US-led war and militarism around the world that we see happening this year and beyond. And just to name some of those, the first big one is on military spending. So the US, UK, Canada, Germany, many of the Eastern European countries, Japan, Korea just announced, are all dishing out money to keep the war in Ukraine going. Not to end the war in Ukraine, but to keep it going for as long as it takes for the US and NATO to get ahead of it. Honestly, from what I'm seeing, there, like Julia mentioned, there were about 5 rounds of peace talks, and all the time the US and NATO were pushing for no, keep this going until we can damage Russia. We have actually, you can point to times, and we have heard US military personnel saying whether they've known they were being listened to or not, saying we want to keep this war going to weaken Russia. We see a war being kept going slowly so that Russia can slowly be drained, and a wannabe NATO state is consistently slowly kept adrift. And what is happening? People are being slaughtered. People are dying. Russians, Ukrainians are being slaughtered for this to happen. And in the global north, where this funding is coming from, popularity of this is draining by the month. We're seeing people take actions against this. We're seeing people do teach-ins on the streets, in their churches, in their schools, against military spending to Ukraine and other countries. Bike tour, there have been actually big bike tours against military spending in Europe. That's been a major point. In the global north, it is actually a responsibility of people to fight back against this military spending that is coming from our tax dollars, whether you're from the US, Australia, United Kingdom, other places in the EU, Japan. It's our money that is going to fuel the militarization of countries like the Philippines, Ukraine, India, and other countries like that. In the Resist US-led War movement, we have a big campaign, and many of our members in the global north are taking this up, and it is called Cut Ties with War Profiteers. And that is targeting the weapons companies themselves. So these weapons companies, massively rich, we have a primer on them ourselves from Resist US-led War on our website. But these are companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Raytheon, L3 Harris, Elbit. These are names we see plastered when we're hearing things about the war industry, because they're making billions of dollars off of this. And they have their tentacles everywhere. They have corporate sponsorships. They have educational sponsorships. Boeing sponsors a museum exhibit in my own city of Portland, Oregon. They're everywhere, and they're trying to justify their existence by being everywhere. So we have this campaign that people are taking up. We're seeing it from our members, mostly on college campuses, but trying to cut their institutional ties with these companies. Cutting school internships, cutting investments. In the Northwest here, from Portland and Seattle, our Resist members are targeting Boeing. We have a Resist member in Maryland that is targeting Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman on their campus. This isn't just cutting ties, like financial ties from these companies. This is how we build a movement against the war industry, against the military-industrial complex that is leading to this massive militarization around the world and is still letting the US teeter-totter as the dominant imperialist power in the world today. I say teeter-tottering because it is definitely on its way down. That is why we're seeing such massive and nightmarish military buildup in Eastern Europe, in Asia Pacific, and everywhere else around the world. And also, I can't mention our Cut Ties to the War Profiteers campaign without celebrating our members and our partners in Canada, who just this past weekend, I think it was this past weekend, it was about a week ago, rallied against CANSEC, and that is the largest weapons trade show in North America. This is one where that has all of the weapons companies I just named are there. And the Canadian Defense Minister opened it with this big speech about how the industry is helping, Canada's security. But there were activists outside saying that this is not in our security. War is a racket, no wars for profit was their main slogan. Again, bringing this attention to, really, it comes down to the profit motive and competition over more profits that is making this happen. So shout out to all of the Canadian activists who rallied outside CANSEC and made some disruptions there. I will also mention that there are major military exercises that are happening. One of those is going to happen next week, the largest ever NATO air exercise in Europe. This is called Air Defender 23. Thousands, I didn't get the exact number, it's somewhere on my tabs here, but these thousands of troops. The US is sending National Guard there, every NATO country. Japan was just given NATO partnership status around the G7. They will have planes there. They are going to be demonstrating a quote unquote defense of a NATO country if it's invaded. But we know that this is a big show against Russia there. And there are people gearing up to protest this any way we can, to say this is not a show of security, this is a show of provocation. The same thing is gearing up to happen next year in Hawaii. The Rim of the Pacific naval exercises are happening that are bringing, I'm just to quote some stuff from our anti-militarism agenda. In 2022, this had 25,000 military personnel, 38 ships, 170 aircraft, 4 submarines from 26 different countries. These are countries from all over the Pacific and even countries outside the Pacific. Israel participates in the Rim of the Pacific. Folks in the US, especially folks in Hawaii, are gearing up to protest RIMPAC next year and say, again, this is not a show of peace, of security, this is a show of provocation. And finally, the last 2 things I'll mention is also in the US, we are gearing up to protest the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, or APEC. This is their ministerial meetings and final heads of state summit will be happening over the next half of the year here in the US. This is where they're trying to pass a new free trade deal, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And why that's important, I'll read from our anti-militarism agenda. This is geared particularly at helping the US seize control of semiconductor supply chains to increase its industrial base for weapons development. This agreement, if passed, will be a further provocative move towards China as the US seeks to monopolize investments in production and trade in the Pacific. This is a trade war that is being made into a hot war. And finally, because my time is wrapping up, I do want to recognize one major aspect of militarism in the global north, and that is the one that is enacted on people in the global north too, especially national minorities, indigenous people, Black folks. Racism and white supremacy is an inherent part of policing, which is an arm of US militarism. So I'll read this last part from our anti-militarism agenda, just to finish off. And that is that the US police and military commit state-sponsored murder and terror worldwide. There is blatant police cooperation in such major urban areas as Atlanta, where the $90 million, 85-acre so-called Cop City training facility is being constructed. Baltimore, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Los Angeles, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, New York, Oakland, St. Paul, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and many others, with police being permitted by city government to commit unspeakable crimes against the people. Black, Indigenous, Muslim, and migrant communities, as well as movements for Black liberation, Indigenous decolonization, and others face blatant racist violence. Israel and other oppressive states conduct an active and ongoing police exchange program, which has trained thousands of law enforcement officials how to brutalize innocent, unarmed people in the United States, while the federal 1033 program gives military-grade gear to local police forces. White supremacy is and always has been an open tool of US-led war and repression, and it will exist until US imperialism is brought down. And that is why movements against police militarization in the global north are inseparable and in a complete solidarity with movements against militarization against the global south. It is not reforms, not asking that'll get us the answers we need. It is international solidarity and active militant unity and action. And that is what APRN and Resist hope to bring and bridge with primers and events like this. So I'm a little over time, so I'll pass it back. Thank you all.
Thank you, Cody. It's really great to be reminded that although the US war machine has footholds across the world, the people have been uniting and resisting against our common enemy. And as Cody mentioned, Resist has primers and educational materials available on their social media accounts and in their website. So also give them a visit. And if you're interested in joining their campaigns, I'm sure they're more than happy to welcome more peace-loving people in their ranks. And yeah, for those who have just joined us, welcome to Rise of Tensions, Threats to Peace, back-to-back primers on militarism launch. Yes, you may download our primer on NATO and primer on military agreements through the Zoom link or through the QR code on our background. We'll also be posting the download link in the chat box. And you may also check those download links on our social media platforms. So make sure to check us out. But yeah, we're not done yet. It's time now to lend our ears to our panel of reactors who will share with us today their thoughts on our first three speakers, their thoughts on the two primers on militarism, and their thoughts on what needs to be done. So please allow me to introduce our panelists. First, we have Ms. Renuka Kad from Vikas Adyayan Kendra from India, followed by Reverend Jiang Chanwon from the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. And later on, please refer to the projected presentation for the English translation. And then next is Mr. Yoshio Nakamura from AWC Japan. Then we'll have Mr. Zagros Tolhildan from the Academy of Democratic Modernity. This will be followed by Mr. Oz Karahan of the Union of Cypriots from Cyprus. And then we'll have Ms. Winmon Ki representing the Myanmar Student Union of Skyline College. All right, let's hear what they have to say. So let's start with Ms. Renuka first.
Yes.
Go ahead, Renuka.
Yeah. Thank you, Vincent. Good morning, everyone. Yes, the primer launching is a very good initiative, which is run by the APRN. And yes, I totally agree with the Cody and Teddy, what they shared, how the military and police has suppressed the people's voices. Means for the reaction, I would like to share the few things about the India situation. where the many reclamation projects is going on, road development projects is going on. And for the forcefully started the work, police has brutally killed and brutally harass the people. Those are fight for their rights. And in the talking about the Indian military in 2023 and 2024, our budget, annual union budget, is almost at 73.8 billion defense budget. It is 13.8% of the total budget. And in this 73.8 million budget, only 50% part, that is the 53.8%, is spent on the defense procurement and modernizations. So that is a big question, being an Indian and being a citizen of these nations, why the country needs military, and how, means why they against the people voices. So this is the situation is going on. As you maybe read in the media, the Manipur is burning nowadays. Kashmir and Leh Ladakh is the situation is going on. In the western part of India, the many coastal development projects going on, which is of course trying to stop by the police and military. So this is the overall situation, and of course this primer launch is helpful for the people, grassroots activists and students, those are raising their voices for the people rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Renuka. And now we'll have Reverend Jiang Chanwan next to provide to share with us his thoughts.
네, 안녕하세요. Hello, everyone. 내 이름은 장창원입니다. 나는 세계 반제국주의 반대 플랫폼에서 공동대표를 맡고 있습니다. 우리는 지난 5월 20일 G7 반대 히로시마 미팅에서 만나서 좋은 행동을 했고, 지금 또 이렇게 만나게 돼서 너무 기쁘고 좋습니다. 우리 지역에 내가 살고 있는 오산 평택 미군 기지는 한국전쟁 이후에 계속 만들어졌고, 그 한국전쟁 이후부터 지금까지 미군이 군사훈련을 계속하고 있습니다. 최근에 러시아와 군사작전이 이루어진 이후에는 한국 미군 기지는 전쟁 상태입니다. 1년 동안 계속 전쟁 연습을 하였고, 지금 한국이 1950년 미국과 한국전쟁 이후에 지금까지 한반도에서는 휴전이지만, 그러나 군사 합의서에 의해서 전쟁 연습과 또 심리적인 전쟁을 계속하고 있습니다. 이 협정은 한국 전쟁이 끝날 때 체결됐지만 영구한 남과 북의 분단을 만들고 있습니다. 우리는 그러한 남과 북의 한 민족의 분단을 원치 않고, 우리는 하나의 평화로운 한반도를 만들기 위한 일로서 우리는 계속 하지만, 미군은 지금 28,000명이 넘는 군대가 한국에 주둔하고 있습니다. 이러한 현실에 대한 우리는 미군 나가라는 활동을 오산 평택을 중심으로 해서 계속하고 있고, 또 기타 한국에 있는 미군 기지에는 모두 우리 함께 미군 나가라는 투쟁을 계속하고 있습니다. 앞에서 우리 민중의 정치 상황에 대한 필리핀의 데디나 또 지금 코디 빈센트가 설명한 내용들이 너무 잘 되어 있지만, 우리 한국의 평택 오산 미군기지 철거운동은 매주 목요일 환경 감시 활동을 포함해서 매일 우리는 미군 나가라는 그 활동을 하고 있습니다. 이런 활동은 한반도의 문제만이 아니라 필리핀, 대만, 그리고 지금 우크라이나, 또 여러 나라들이 있는데, 특별히 아시아에서는 미국이 마르코스를 비롯해서 박정희, 또 인도네시아의 수하르트 대통령을 이 세 나라를 중심으로 미군은 아시아를 지배하고 있습니다. 이제 오산 평택에 미군 기지 철거 운동하는 우리는 이번에 G7 미팅처럼 우리 아시아의 군사 기지에 대한 소통과 연대를 계속해서 우리 지금 나토를 반대하고 여기 이렇게 사진으로 보이지만 나토를 반대하고 미 제국주의 자본을 반대하는 운동을 계속할 것입니다. 그리고 이러한 일들이 한 사례로 7월 27일, July 27은 우리 한국 전쟁이 끝난 날입니다. 그 끝난 날은 한반도 남쪽에서는 전쟁이 끝난 휴전일이지만 북쪽에서는 거대한 미국 자본과 투쟁해서 싸워서 전쟁을 해서 이겼다는 그러한 승리의 날입니다. 7월 27일 승리의 날을 세계 모든 작은 나라들, 작지만 자존심을 가지고 자주적으로 그 힘을 가졌을 때 미국도 이길 수 있다 하는 자신감을 가지고 세계 모든 나라들이 함께 연대할 것을 노스 코리아는 주장하고 있습니다. 그리고 지금 7월 27일을 기해서 한반도 우리 평택에서는 이러한 휴전과 미국에 대한 투쟁의 승리를 기뻐하는 의미로 미군 나가라는 그러한 캠페인을 미군 부대 26km를 around we are 2,600 많은 사람들이 그 미군 기지를 포위하고 7월 27일 행사를 계획하고 있습니다. 여러분을 초대하고 여러분도 한국에 와서 함께 양키고 홈을 외칠 수 있는 그러한 우리의 동지로서 Long Live International Solidarity 만세할 수 있는 투쟁의 현장에서 우리는 계속할 것입니다. 우리 미군이 나갈 때까지 지금 미국의 우크라이나 전쟁을 통해서 나타난 3차 세계대전을 우리는 거부하고 평화로운 한반도가 평화로운 아시아, 양키 고홈 아시아 모든 세계의 미군 기지가 돌아갈 것을 우리는 주장합니다. 그리고 지금 우리 지역에는 뭐 미군이 전쟁 연습하다가 떨어지기도 하고 또 많은 미군으로 인한 사고가 많은데 이것은 한반도의 문제만이 아니라 전 세계의 문제이기 때문에 전 세계 민중들이 하나도 연대해서 양키고홈하고 제국주의 미국을 물리칠 수 있기를 희망합니다. 투쟁으로 인사합니다. 투쟁. 네, 마치겠습니다. 땡큐. 투쟁.
Thank you, Reverend Jiang. Up next, we have Mr. Yoshio Nakamura from AWC Japan. Unfortunately, he isn't able to join us today, but he did prepare a pre-recorded video message for us. So please allow us to present that.
It is very timely that the two primers are launched today, because we are witnessing escalation of military tensions in Asian Pacific and the NATO's expansion in Europe just now. We Asia-wide campaign Japan, along with international comrades and friends, just held a series of actions against the G7 summit meeting in Hiroshima last month, May 2023. The G7 joint statement emphasized further strengthening of military ties of the Western imperialist powers in order to counter China and Russia. The Hiroshima vision on nuclear issue was also not about nuclear disarmament actually, but rather justifies a nuclear monopoly and nuclear deterrence strategy by the US and other Western nuclear powers. G7 summit and its result will further escalate global military tensions. These two primers provide a basic understanding of history and the current situation of US-led bilateral and multilateral military agreements and their true purpose in the context of today's international situation. At the same time, we can learn people's rejection and resistance to imperialist ambitions through these primers. As the primers mentioned, not only the US-led bilateral military agreements, but also multi-layered security frameworks are being formed in Asian Pacific now through the Quad, AUKUS, or US-Japan-South Korea trilateral military cooperation. They are a step to form an Asian version of NATO, mainly to encircle China. At the same time, bilateral military cooperation among US allied countries and partners it is also developing with same purpose. For example, Japan is expanding its military cooperation with Australia, the UK, France, South Korea, and Philippines. The latest one is the Hiroshima Accord between Japan and the UK, which aims to strengthen mutual military cooperation in Asian Pacific regions. It's our common task to resist rising military tensions and war drives. We believe that these two primers will contribute to advancement of the anti-war movement in respective countries and our international common work.
All right, thank you so much, Nakamura-san from AWC Japan. And now let's hear what Mr. Zagros Tolihildan from the Academy of Democratic Modernity has to say.
Good morning, comrade. Everybody can hear me?
Yes, we can
Yep.
hear you loud and clear.
So about the situation in Kurdistan, especially following the re-election of Erdogan and the election that happened last month, that I already have a impact on the situation in Kurdistan. So first about this election, we cannot consider the result as legitimate because we have seen a very long criminalization of the party representing the aspiration for liberation of the Kurdish people in Turkey. So the People's Democratic Party or HDP, with many members being still held in jail. During the election itself, there have been a lot of intimidation with armed forces into the voting place, especially in the Kurdish area. A lot of fraud, but despite all these threats and intimidation and the repression, we can see that still there have been a massive mobilization in northern Kurdistan, occupied by Turkey. Despite this risk of jail, of torture, the people of northern Kurdistan or southeast Turkey have been massively voting against Erdogan. But this re-election mean that the oppression against the Kurdish people, against the Turkish democratic and socialist forces will continue. And the war against the people will also probably increase and continue. This war against the Kurdish liberation movement is happening in all parts of Kurdistan, in northern Syria through occupation and constant low-intensity warfare, which aim to destroy the Rojava revolution happening there since now 10 years. In Bakur or northern Kurdistan, I already mentioned this total repression, and there have been also like a lot of attack against the people with the destruction of cities in 2016, and that are those attack and repression which are increasing and continuing until now. In southern Kurdistan or northern Iraq, through also invasion, military invasion and occupation of the mountain and the resistance of the guerrilla of the liberation movement there, and the pressure that the Turkish state is putting on Iraqi state to close the Mahmur refugee camp, where last week forces have been sent there. But after 2 weeks resistance of the people, for now the forces there have left. What we need also to understand is that this Turkish expansionism is a threat to all the region, not only against the Kurdish liberation movement, but for the whole Middle East. So we can see now occupation, invasion in Syria, in Iraq, but also expansionism in Libya and Karabakh, where Turkish state is sending its Islamist mercenaries, proxy forces. What we need also to understand is that all this attack, all this war are only possible through NATO active support, because historically Turkey, together with Israel, is a pillar of Western imperialist policies in Middle East. And we see it's including also this war, those what I'm mentioning, because without the active military and political support of the West, and first of US ally of Turkey, all those war will not be possible. And especially behind those attacks against the revolution in Rojava, behind this attack against the Kurdish liberation movement, of course, Turkey is making it, but behind it, it's the US, UK, German, and Israel imperialism who want to crush this revolution because it's for them an obstacle to their imperialist project. And yes, I think I'm running out of my time. So thanks for everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Zagros. Indeed, it is these military alliances such as NATO that really enables, facilitates, and perpetuates the violent social realities that we are facing every day. Sorry about that. Up next, we have a pre-recorded video message from Mr. Ozgarahan from the Union of Cypriots. So please allow us to share our screen. One moment.
Dear comrades, on behalf of the Union of Cypriots, I congratulate the APRN and Resist for organizing this event, and I thank all comrades who contributed. NATO is becoming brain dead. These are not my words, but they belong to French President Emmanuel Macron in 2019 when he called for the creation of an European army. Soon after NATO received its kiss of life following the 2020 elections in the United States by the new administration of Joe Biden. After the provocations of the West in Ukraine, Russia began its occupation, and now NATO is once again popular with the countries that previously had no interest in joining. After Finland's accession, it will soon be time for Sweden to become a new member of NATO. While people around the world are calling for peace and opposing this imperialist war, Europe also faces new issues in the states that NATO established after the fall of Yugoslavia, such as Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. Especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, current unrest is caused by the apartheid-style, anti-democratic federal system that was implemented by foreign powers to keep country unstable in order to protect interest and military presence of the West. On the other hand, Cyprus, a country that rejected similar arrangement, was punished by NATO with an occupation in 1974. Today, 5 NATO armies are present in the country, which often referred to as unsinkable aircraft carrier by the imperialists. In the past 5 years, the United States has used every conflict to increase its presence in Europe and Eastern Mediterranean. Even the conflict between 2 NATO members, Greece and Turkey, resulted in the United States increasing its military bases in Greece. Next week, Germany will host an air exercise as part of Defender 23 with 10,000 participants and 250 aircraft from 25 nations respond to a simulated attack on a NATO member country. This will be NATO's largest air exercise ever conducted in Europe. We call on all anti-imperialist organizations to protest and show their will for peace. We must continue the struggle until the shores of Europe, North Africa and West Asia liberated from the United States 6th Fleet and shores of the Pacific are liberated from the United States 7th Fleet. Long live international solidarity.
Thank you, Mr. Ozgarahan. And for our last reactor, last but not the least, we have Ms. Win Mon Ki, representing the Myanmar Student Union of Skyline College. The floor is yours, Win Mon.
Hello, everyone. I'm Win of Myanmar Student Union. And Myanmar Student Union is part of All Burma Federation Student Union, who consist of youth and students fighting against the dictatorship of the fascist Myanmar armed forces. We uphold the beliefs of self-determination, fighting for relevant education, students' rights, and international solidarity amongst the youth, and anti-dictatorship. We stand in solidarity with all organizations and movements against wars of aggression and inter-imperialist war. Right now, the Myanmar youth are fighting directly against the fascist Myanmar armed forces, alongside ethnic revolutionary organizations, alongside the general strike committees in the homeland. The ongoing civil war has killed 3,632 civilians, detained and sentenced 18,961, and arrested 23,292. Here, the NATO primer serves as a tool to strengthen our analysis and highlights the history of rising fascism and how fascist multilateral alliances like that of NATO hinder and actively oppose national liberation struggles, such as that of our siblings in the Philippines. NATO's history is rooted in the occupation of the Indo-Asia Pacific. In the primer, it highlights as well the Japanese occupation of Burma and the ways it has committed atrocities against the Myanmar people. The very tools and tactics Japan had used are directly what the Myanmar military has inherited and were trained to do. The tools of occupation, war, rape, cutting of resources, communications, food to civilians is exactly what the fascist Myanmar military is doing today. We know that alliances such as NATO are formed to militarize our communities and quell any resistance and divide the world for profit interests and their own gain. In the primer, it states new multilateral alliances like the Quad and AUKUS arise as desperate attempts for the US to maintain hold of its strategic gains. AUKUS, involving US, Japan, India, Australia, we see that as the US makes new alliances, it exposes more what other states gain to benefit from the suffering of the Myanmar people as well. India, for example, has also supplied arms to the Myanmar military, being the third largest arms supplier from 2017 to 2021. Australia has also supplied communications with radio equipment to the fascist Myanmar armed forces. As the US encroaches further, it heightens also and exposes what they're fighting up against in competition with China and Russia, which both all further contest areas for control in the Asia Pacific. Knowing this, Myanmar Student Union has also joined the campaign for No to APEC, No to the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which will be meeting in San Francisco in an all-leader summit to dictate economic policies for the future that we see as unsustainable and destroying the world. At the end of the day, these states will be asking for the same thing, which is for the people of Myanmar to stop resisting. The US has already been pushing for quelling the resistance through pushing for the 5-point consensus through ASEAN, declaring that as a solution following the Myanmar coup. And we foresee this being propagated through APEC, G7, and so forth, with the consensus, 5-point consensus being an agreement between the ASEAN states, which is currently chaired this year by Indonesia. What the 5-point consensus asks for is the cessation of violence in Myanmar, and all parties shall exercise utmost restraint. It's encouraging dialogue between different parties. It, determines a special envoy to facilitate this, to execute, humanitarian assistance. But what it's essentially asking for is for Myanmar people to accept the dictatorship and to shake hands with our oppressor. So we see ASEAN, NATO, and APEC go hand in hand in plundering our homelands, and we say, hell no. We will stand alongside our comrades and organizations here and call for all to support our cause against dictatorship. So let us be informed of our history, to strategize and use our tools, such as that of the primer, to advance people's movement, to expose the roots of imperialism and oppose fascism. Our calls are stop killing our youth, end the airstrikes, uproot the fascist Myanmar armed forces, and from the people's movements here, as we see from Korea, Japan, US, Kurdistan, Union of Cypriots, Philippines to Myanmar and India, long live international solidarity, and let's resist all wars of aggression.
Thank you, Winmon. And with that, let's give all our panelists a big round of applause. And yes, I would also like to acknowledge the great suggestion that was raised by Reverend Jiang a while ago, which that the primers should be translated to as many languages as possible so that it could be accessible for all people, regardless of their background and their context. And yes, we'd like to inform everyone that our team is really working towards that goal, and we will keep all of you updated. And of course, if you would like to volunteer and would just like to help in that in the pursuit of translating the primers, of course, feel free to reach out. And yes, thank you once again. And yeah, as you could see, the very diverse composition of the panelists, it just really further highlights how our anti-imperialist struggle is getting bigger and getting stronger by the day. Our panelists have shared how these primers are meaningful under this context of intensifying imperialism and fascism. So make sure that you download and read our primers, which you can get through the QR code on our Zoom background. Yes, and at this point in our program, we'll be having our question and answer segment. So go ahead and field those questions. Just raise your hand to call our attention. And alternatively, you may also use the chat box if you're feeling shy. So do we have any questions for our speakers and reactors? Maybe even questions regarding the primers? Do we have any questions here? Maybe we have questions from our live broadcast on Facebook. Okay, so we have one question now from our live stream. It was a comment. It says here that the 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 launch or the webinar is really composed, right? There's lots of people from different countries who are speaking and supporting the primer launch, and of course this anti-imperialist struggle. But what can we do to further unite and to fight back against imperialism? I guess this is addressed to all of the speakers and reactors. So I think this is more of like, how can we, link arms and help each other, knowing that there are so many people's movements and anti-imperialist movements across the world. So would any of our speakers or reactors like to answer that question?
Hello.
Yes. Go ahead, Reverend Jiang.
Yeah, we are very well network APRN we are good meeting G7 anti-war and imperialist group out. But now in some more international communication where we are every time making Korea military report 1 week, 1 page. But we are sharing base, America base and also military out want group, some APRN networking, sharing page in our website and homepage. Always we are recording and sharing solidarity network.
Thank you, Reverend Jiang. Yes, that's a great idea. That's a great idea that military reports and other documents and fact sheets, we should really compile them together and have them posted on all platforms that we have, really exhaust all avenues. That way we could really draw the line and show how we are being oppressed. And of course, to highlight the people's resistance. We agree with you on that note. And oh yeah, maybe Jones would like to further translate that.
Okay, so he said that we have a good experience in Kyoto during the anti-G7 rally. Okay. Okay, so he's suggesting now to continue this what is this campaign, and those who have US bases in their country or military bases, we have to connect each other. So let us share what is happening in the US bases and the people and the struggle of the people. Maybe within a month, we can share everything to our network so that we know what happened in the region. And then we can work together to abolish these US facilities in our region.
Thank you, Jones. And yeah, who could forget that iconic Japan campaign, the anti-G7 campaign in Japan, where while the G7 leaders were meeting in Hiroshima, the people's organizations and international organizations were marching on the streets of Hiroshima as well to demand justice and, of course, to say junk the G7 and all of their activities. And I see Cody raising his hand. Cody, would you like to answer also?
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with Reverend Jang. And the campaign against the G7 was an incredible show of unity from people from different countries coming together to say, it's a simple thing, junk G7. Resist and APRN also joined European and other organizers last year in Europe against the NATO summit with a similar call, dismantle NATO. Again, we are calling to not negotiate with these alliances. We're calling to use our power to make them afraid of the people enough to say to actually back off from their repressive activities. It is those gatherings, those international gatherings, when we can bring people across borders, get past cultural differences that are most of the time just imposed on us. There is so much we actually have alike when we can get to know each other and see what our interests are. So more of those activities between countries, between North and South are definitely needed. And I think that, I would echo the same call that to get these materials translated and then maybe continue to having specific teach-ins that are in specific languages. That is going to be a major point too, to bridge those differences. But really, when there is an action against a US base in the Philippines, there should be an echo actions in the US. When there are actions against Australian military exercises in Korea, there should be echo actions in Australia, and so on and so forth, to let the people know that, let the governments know, the military leaders know that, this is not in our name. What we all do together as international organizers, let's continue to raise the people's voice up there in our name.
Thank you, Cody. That's really a great message of unity. Just like to highlight that, the US and their member countries in their military alliances are very much organized. And in that same sense, I guess we have no choice but to organize ourselves also and to really link arms and to fight back against imperialism. Do we have any other speakers or reactors who would also like to answer that question? Okay, because if not, we have another question here from our live broadcast. The question is goes along the lines of, how do we get the primer? What do you think are like the best ways to get the primer to the people on the ground? Because they are the ones who will benefit the most from these educational materials. So it's more of how do we distribute and how do we make sure that we effectively get the message across to the communities and the people who are resisting. Would anyone like to answer that question?
Yeah, if I may.
Oh, go ahead, Teddy.
Of course, now we're in the age of social media and the internet. So I guess a very practical and convenient way to distribute this is through the internet, through social media, the networks, etc. But it's not simply a matter of distribution. What is important is that these references are used for actual discussions and sharing of experiences on the ground. Because primers can only explain one aspect of an issue, but as far as relating the issues discussed in the primers to the everyday condition of ordinary people, that takes more than distributing primers. So again, we will have to tap into our networks, into our organizations, to make sure that these primers are actually discussed on the ground, that they are understood in the context of the people who are reading them, whether they are farmers in some third world global south country or some intellectual in the industrialized world. There has to be deeper understanding based on their context and their experience. And I think that is where our organizations and our organizers and our activists will have to be active in. So yeah, so distribution, I think, is not so much the problem as to how these primers are actually used to strengthen the anti-imperialist movement in various countries.
Thank you, Mr. Teddy. And yes, it's very much true that we really need to operationalize these primers. It's not enough that we distribute them. It's not enough that they just collect dust on our shelves. We must really go down into the streets, to the communities, and make sure that it's being related on a level that they're comfortable with and which they could really understand. I think Julia was raising her hand a while ago. Julia, would you also like to answer that question?
Hi, Vincent. First of all, thank you so much to our set of speakers and panelists and all of the sharings from the participants from this launching. I would actually echo what Teddy has mentioned. I think it's one thing making it available online or offline. It is another thing to really have that kind of discussion with communities that are affected by these military advancements and agreements made by US and China. So it would be good in a practical sense to have small group discussions or consultations with communities or sectors to help them to help bring awareness regarding these regional military formations that affects the local levels as well, from the increased presence of military bases to rural and aerial bombings. I think it would be beneficial for them as well to understand the interconnectedness of these issues, and of course forge campaigns and further strengthen our movements from the ground. So it is a challenge for regional organizations such as APRN, as well as other organizations operating inside and outside Asia Pacific, to stand in solidarity with communities that are most affected of these violence. So in a practical sense, discussions, old as Teddy mentioned in the chat box, old style teach-ins work. they really do. So yeah, that would be all for me.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Julia. And it also says here, yes, as Cody mentioned, host teach-ins at your school, after work, in your neighborhood, anywhere you can reach more people. And I guess that's really the challenge for us, that to really exhaust all the avenues, all the spaces at our disposal to make sure that we reach as many people as possible. Okay. Okay, so all right, okay. So going back, I think we have time for one more question. And I'm being notified that we have one more question from the live broadcast. And it says here, thank you for a very timely and relevant primer launching. And the question is, are there any international anti-imperialist organizations or networks that we could join or we could participate in so that we could contribute to this global movement? So would anyone like to answer that? The question is, are there any international anti-imperialist organizations or networks that we could contribute, where we could contribute towards the anti-imperialist struggle? Would any of our speakers or reactors like to answer that? Yes, Cody said here in the comment, in the chat box, join resist US-led war movement, join the Asia Pacific Research Network. Yes, thank you very much for that shameless plug. But yes, do indeed try to check us out and join us if you're interested. We're very open and welcome to any of those who are interested in joining us. Teddy, you're raising your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, since we're on the matter of shameless plugs, I think just some of the anti-imperialist formations that come to mind. Of course, you have the International League of People's Struggles. I guess you can visit their website and see how you can be part of that. You also have the People's, I don't remember, United. Maybe you would have. I seem to forget it's a newly formed formation of International
People's
Front.
Front.
That's it. Yeah. And then you have some regional formations like the Asia-wide campaign mentioned by Mr. Nakamura earlier. That's in the Asia Pacific region. So there's no lack of organizations and networks that you can be part of. Whether it's the Asia Pacific region, Indo-Pacific region, or Europe, you can pick and choose.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that sharing. Indeed, the International League of People's Struggles and the International People's Front are also open to all individuals, organizations, and networks and institutions who are interested in joining. The IPF, International People's Front, and ILPS were also present in the anti-G7 campaign in Japan. They were the ones who also mobilized on the streets of Hiroshima to counter and to raise the voice of the people. Julia, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Vincent. Aside from regional platforms, I think it is also equally important to be a part of local platforms that are anti-imperialist as well. So regional and international fights also starts at the local level. So the organization of Teddy Bayan, it would be good for any Filipinos who are here to be part of these organizations, as well as the platform of Reverend Jang. Any Koreans who are also present in this event would be good to link arms with these organizations in the fight against imperialist wars. So, yeah.
Thank you, Julia. Indeed, join your local or your national anti-imperialist organizations. We need all the help that we could get when it comes to really liberating the people, from US imperialism. So make sure to join on all levels, may it be local, your community, or national, even international. Yes, and we have here a comment from Kurniawan Sabar from Indies in Indonesia. One important thing we should be aware of is that the US military expansion and aggression go side by side with capital export and expansion in the region, so that we also need to reveal this relationship in order to deepen the context of the use of the primer in our country and the Asia Pacific region. That's really, really true, and I can't agree with you more, Wawan, because I remember one of our member organizations said in a workshop that with each military operation, with each bullet, there's always an economic policy behind it. that's being endorsed. That's why there's always the presence of military to make sure that it's, that there is no resistance against them. So that's very much true. There's really the underlying economic factors, the economic motives that pushes and drives imperialism. And yes, I think the primers also discussed this, especially during the beginning of the primers, but of course, I won't spoil the contents. That's up for all of our audience to read those primers. And yeah, I guess that's about all the time we have for the question and answer portion. But should you have any more questions, you may send them over via email at secretariat@aprnet.org, and we'll make sure to answer them. Or you may also contact our speakers if you prefer a more direct route. Yes. Yeah, before we close our launching, I'd just like to remind everyone that our primer on NATO and our primer on military agreements can be downloaded via the QR code flashed on our Zoom backgrounds. So please also feel free to let us know what you think of the primers once you've read them via email or on our social media accounts, because we'd really appreciate your feedback. And if you're interested in helping out with the translations to different languages, please let us know. So yeah, I'm sure everyone's already excited to read the primers, but first, let's lend our ears to Ms. Rhonda Ramiro from the Resist US-led War Movement as she officially closes today's launch with a synthesis. The floor is all yours, Rhonda.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our launch of our two primers. They've been a long time coming. Really, when we produced the NATO primer last year, immediately things started to develop. And in some ways we thought, oh no, it's outdated, but actually it's never outdated because it will continue to be a living document as long as we use it to organize and mobilize against the US war machine. So I wanted to just provide a short synthesis of our event tonight and a little summary of what was said. So we started off with a discussion, an introduction by Julia of APRN on the multipolar crisis that we're facing in the world, imperialist rebalancing, which is pushing for strengthened and new military alliances, which serve to enrich the imperialists and oppress the people. We're seeing this more aggressive military positioning. And if we just look at a timeline, which was presented by Julia, of just from last year to this year, every month there seemed to be something new, some new development in US-led militarism that really exposed the agenda that these military alliances are pushing. Right up until June of this year. So the timeline goes through that. But more importantly than just noting the different events that happened, we had to be aware of how these events impact the people. And that was a message really honed in on by Julia. Next, we heard some presentations by Teddy Cancino of Bayan and Cody Urban of the Resist US-led War Movement, speaking about the people's side, about resistance. And we heard the inspiring example of the Filipino people's fight against the bases and how really it's part of a legacy of the Filipino people's resistance against Spanish colonialism, against US imperialism since the turn of the last century, and how the fight for independence from US imperialism inherently included the fight against US militarism and the bases after the so-called independence, and that the fight against the bases was part and parcel of the movement that led to the ouster of the Marcos dictatorship. It was emphasized that the fight against the bases, didn't culminate with a Senate vote. It was about consistent and sustained people's movement against those bases. And that even if that victory was short-lived, the resistance has been long-lived and will continue until the bases are gone, will continue until the Philippines is truly independent. Cody's inspiring presentation talked about the resistance that's happening in the global north, that there is solidarity being built between the North and the South, with the people in the global north trying to take creative action against very specific targets of the US military machine. So for example, on military spending and the people's understanding and making the connection between the massive military budgets that their governments have versus the tiny amount of money that their governments spend on social services and for social good. And so rising movements against that kind of military spending and the people's money being spent for war instead of for the people. Cody also talked about campaigns against the largest military transnational corporations, cutting ties, cutting funds, cutting all support for those corporations, and also celebrated a victory by our comrades in ILPS Canada, which just protested CANSET, the world's largest weapons trade show, at least the largest one in North America, with the slogan, "War is a racket, no wars for profit." So really honing in on what are the aims of these wars. It's for profit, but really the people won't stand for it, and that the people are uniting and resisting against war. Our reactors from India and Korea, Kurdistan, Cyprus, Japan, and from the Burmese diaspora also highlighted the different ways in which these military agreements are being used to oppress the people. And that, again, more examples of military budgets being spent at the cost and detriment of the people. But each one really highlighting the need to resist, and that while war is made possible by NATO, while oppression and occupation of various countries is made possible by NATO and the US-led Western Alliance, liberation will be because of the people and the people continuing to resist. In the words of Oz Karahan from the Union of Cypriots, we need to liberate Europe from the US 6th Fleet and the shores of the Asia Pacific from the US 7th Fleet. And it's that will be done because the people will continue resisting. And then I think to kind of just close it all out, all of our speakers and our fearless MC, Vincent, really highlighted that these primers are tools. The primers provide information about the military alliances, about the agreements, about the different maneuvers of the US military and the imperialist war machine. But the primers only go so far. It's really about the primers being used by us and by the people, by movements, as a tool to further our organizing, to sharpen our understanding, but to be used to organize the people. And so, we encourage everybody to download the primers, to use them. Let us know what you find useful. Let us know if you think that there are things that can be improved about them, and continue to please take action to stop US-led war and militarism. So, we strive for a world, that isn't a multipolar world, but really a world where we have genuine international solidarity, where countries have genuine sovereignty, independence, equality, and can cooperate as equals for mutual benefit. So multilateralism, not the multipolar world that we're living in now. And this will only happen because the people will continue to resist and build that movement. So I'll leave it with that. And thank you to APRN. Thank you to everybody who's here. And please download the primers and use them. Let us know what you think.
Thank you, Rhonda, for a really sharp synthesis of the entire launch. And of course, thank you everyone for tuning in. This has been Rising Tensions, Threats to Peace, a back-to-back primers on militarism launch. We really hope that you download and read our primers on NATO and our primer on military agreements. But more than anything, we hope to see you in the international movement against imperialism. Yes, so before we leave the Zoom room, we'd like to invite everyone to turn on your cameras for a quick group photo to cap off our successful launch for today. All right.